I mean, Christians can allow fear to pick their direction. When you drive up and you're out in the middle of nowhere, or you're driving down some road and all of a sudden you see a sign that says the bridge is out. Okay? Most of us go ahead and go some other direction, right? Why? Because there's something kind of ominous about a bridge out. Right? It's not going to end well. You know, and so most of us don't, we don't do that, just, it's found in the general league. It's just the idea is we don't do that. We see bridge out, we turn around. We go find another way. Except that, if there's no room for that kind of, impossibility, then there's really no room for what God's going to do. God says, listen, I will strengthen you. Well, you don't need strength if you can do it, right? You don't need help. If you can do it, God's going, no, my tasks for you are bigger than the simple little things. So he says, listen, there has to be room for the difficult, the impossible, the incomprehensible. So we cannot let fear tell us we shouldn't go down that road. We have to step back and say, God, if you want me to go down that road, I'll go down that road. Yeah, the bridge is out. The bridge is out, but I'm going to trust that the God who can walk on water is probably going to find another way for me to cross the river. Right? Well, the river's moving on. But the reality is we don't think that way. We let fear tell us, well, God would never do that even today. We're going to talk about inadequacy next week, but God would never do that. God would never pick me for that. There's no way that God wants me to go down that road because that's impossible. Except that God's going, no, that's where I get to win. When you back away from the impossible, when you back away from something that doesn't look right, when you back away from something that just says fear, you take away God's ability to do something. And you restore to yourself control of the situation. Right? I will go down the road with more travel, and everything will be fine. And I'll still get to the same place. I'll just go around. And God's going, no, that's not how it works. Different direction, different destination. And so what you have is you have to be careful. It's interesting that fear is the first human emotion. Right? Adam and Eve. First emotion. Fear of God. Terrified. Ashamed. Right? Isn't it interesting that fear is our first one? We always like to think it was this genuine love oneness between God and man, but that's not, it doesn't say that. And it wasn't love between Adam and Eve. Adam just goes, fantastic, she's ripping my ribs. I'm not really sure that's love at that point. Companionship, sure, but the first human emotion discussed is fear. And isn't it interesting that fear is introduced when? When they step outside of God's plan. As long as they were inside it, they were living the impossible dream, right? They were living in an impossible situation. Eden, right? Naming animals, awesome. All right, right? Isn't that awesome? It's impossible. They were living in Eden, naming animals, eating endless amounts of figs. Right? Well, it had to be figs because he's figly clear. Eating endless amounts of figs, hanging out, right? It's the impossible dream. And then the minute they step outside what God tells them to do, what's their first emotion? Fear. It doesn't mean there was absence of other emotion, but it's the first emotion that the Bible kind of goes into and says, listen. And fear made them make decisions, right? Fear made them do what? Run from God. Run from each other. Great. Good plan. Right? When lions are hanging out, don't run from each other and God. But that's what they did. The minute they let sin into their lives, the minute they stepped outside of what God wanted to do, the first thing they did as human beings was separate. Right? They didn't have the same dressing room. It says they went off and covered themselves because they were embarrassed. Right? And then they hid from God. Doesn't that sound like everything we do? When we start letting sin creep into our lives, first we separate from each other. Right? We separate from God. And God's looking for us. Hello? We're like, right? But that's what's interesting about how God's plan is when he says, listen, I want you to go where the brink is at. I want you to live something that's impossible. Fear cannot stop us from being obedient. Fear cannot stop us from being obedient to God. We cannot let fear, shame, worry, whatever, stop us from obedience. When God asks us to do something, we can't let the fear of whatever it is stop us, because when we do, we end up like Adam and Eve, and we end up way outside and then consumed by fear. Remember what we talked about last week when Jesus said, "Why do you fear men? Fear God." Men can only kill you once. God, He can make eternity a little rough. Remember? It's in the Bible. What about you? You know, the reality is He says, listen, why would you ever go against orders from Dad? My father was a stern man. Is stern? Kind of nice now. He was a stern man when I was a kid. An excuse that would have never worked with my dad. My friends thought it was a good idea at that. If it went against what my dad wanted, it didn't matter what my friends thought. And it didn't matter that I made the decision to make all my friends happy. It didn't matter that, I'm winning, cool popularity awards at school. If my dad didn't want it done, it didn't matter. Now we all know. It's just ignorant. But the reality is just like, Mark is but the idea is that when we go against God and make our own decisions, we can't run around and go, "Oh God, I'm terrified," and God's going, "Well, you did eat the fruit I told you not to. Yes, but you can forgive me." Yes, I can, but guess what? You still have to pass the fruit. That's the reality, right? And sometimes we have to accept that. And then the last thing